I'm supposed to catalogue brittle liturgical books, to note shelf marks and paper condition, to be the polite, invisible hand that keeps a cathedral's memory from unraveling. The work is banal in its holiness. Gloves, a soft brush, the lamp that leaves no fingerprints. I tell myself this the morning I find the folded map because superstition is a useful shield against curiosity. The missal smells of mildew and faint incense. Between folios, a sheet slips loose, and when I unfold it, the parchment is not a chart of pilgrim roads, but an inked diagram of thresholds, cartouches full of sigils, and a line annotated in a hand that is both clerical and private. Go where the bells confess to no one. I should have closed the missal and returned it to its dark shelf. I did not. I fold the sheet small and tuck it into my breast as if it were contraband. The nave breathes around me in tides of incense and damp stone. The Angelus rings, and the sound is both prayer and a coordinate. I am trained to resist narrative in my work, to be precise, to separate fact from fancy, but the ink under my glove seems warm, as if it resents being ignored. The archivist is in his study 2 rooms away. I hear the scrape of his chair and imagine handing the sheet to him and saying it is nothing. I imagine his face closing into the calm of a man who counts things for a living. I imagine the smile he gives when he thinks I will look away. I should have handed the sheet to him and walked back to the lamp. I do not. In the vestry, I find a drawer that the inventory software returns no record for. Inside, there is a key with a bow worn by many palms, the brass dark where fingers have polished it with a restless ritual. The archivist calls it for things that should not be numbered, and his smile is an oath. He does not ask me how the map came into my hands. He does not need to. He lays the key on the table, and the metal seems to absorb light. I feel the weight of unfinished vows. I should have given the sheet and the key back then and said my curiosity had been a mistake. I do not. The key sits in my palm and trembles like a confession. That night the choir stalls sit like rows of arrested time. Carved misericords show saints midwim, saints with faces that look guilty under moonlight. The map marks a red thread beneath the eastern bench. I pull at it, and the oak yields a seam. A hatch opens on air that smells of wax and grave. My candle sputters, but I go down because curiosity is the thing I mistake for courage, because the part of me that catalogues wants to put a label on what should not be named. Below the hatch, the architecture changes. The benevolent geometry of the church gives way to low vaults and shelves in tiers, like ribs of an enormous sleeping thing. The shelves are labelled not with sancta, but with transgressions. Glass cases hold objects like specimens. A vial marked Idolatria, Conclusus, 1724. A tiny box stamped Blasphemia Susurrata, Imbalsamata, 1891. The ledger system here is a taxonomy for trespass. Each entry reads nomen, locus, numerous. Names arc in hands that hesitate like marginalia, dates line up like funerary stones. I take down a volume, and my thumb fogs the margin. Whether that fog is breath or ink, I cannot tell. There is a notch beside a name where the paper looks newly abraded, as if the ledger had been scraped at the moment my eye fell on it. I should have stopped when that mark first appeared. I did not. I keep turning pages because a part of me wants proof that I am not inventing architecture from guilt. The ledger answers when it is looked at. The page seems to breathe in response to my disbelief. There are marginal instructions that read like praeturn procedure. Custodia nominum, ultima vigilia, ad alterum numerum. The language treats names like currency and nights like due dates. I run my gloved fingers along an index and feel the relief where ink has worn thin. One entry contains only a single word in an older hand, Proxima. Beside it is a date I do not know and a place that is not on any map I keep. There is a projection in the vault that the public never sees. Lanterns slides throw Latin across plaster. Nomen, numerous, premium, name, number, recompense. A recorded voice reads names with the cadence of a chant. For a moment I think the voice is an old choir tape until it says my full name and a future date. I think I am imagining it until I pull an unmarked box from a shelf and find a cassette with my own voice on it. A tape I made years ago for an oral history project, an interview about local devotions. On the tape, my voice reads, with the same casual inflection I used in the office, the name and the date, as if the future were a line in my own hand. I try to leave then, to take the sheet back to its shelf, to return the key and close the drawer on what an archivist has no business knowing. The cloister stones are the same. Pigeons shuffle by indifferent, yet the bells now sound like tally marks. At every crossing, the paving has a tiny brass chip inset like punctuation, and at each ring I feel a notch close somewhere in the vault. The world has acquired marginalia that I alone see. I tell myself I will burn the map in the hearth and confess everything in the morning. I tell myself I should have stopped when the archivist smiled without blinking or when the ledger made its new notch. But I kept reading, and the ledger kept counting, and habit is the hand that keeps pulling at an open wound. I did not close the ledger then. I did not return the key. I did not make these disappear. I kept the sheet folded in my desk and the key under my pillow as if small superstitions could shield me. Now every bell is a page turning, and every prayer tastes faintly of vellum. I tell myself confession will free me, but the confessional slit in the lower vault waits with its fog, and I know I will answer again and alone. The vestry is a small, cathedraled room of its own, where vestments sleep on racks, and the slow clock of service time hangs like a promise on the wall. It smells of beeswax, boiled cloth, and a centuries-old patience that teaches men to wait through liturgies. When I push the heavy door, a dozen heads look up from polishing platelets and mending cassocks. Their movements cease as if an agreed silence has been broken. Ordinary faces become watchful when they discover that a stranger, or an archivist's assistant with some scrap of curiosity, has placed a sheet on the table that is not a bill of materials, but an instruction. I set the map on the table between chalice diagrams and repair notes. The light from the high window makes the ink look like a confession. Father Morley leans forward and studies a sigil with the same care he would give to a chalice. He touches a mark with the pad of his finger and does not flinch. His palm bears the small calluses of a life that has turned pages and turned prayers into work. He does not ask where I found the sheet. He only says, as if reading a line from a long office, "You must understand this is not a wandering thing." The others nod with a gravity that feels like both benediction and command. They begin to speak in words that rearrange the room into duty. Conclave here is council, not election. Rubric is not margin, but rule. Reliquary does not simply hold a relic, but seals an account. Terminology becomes a tool. They explain, with the patient tone of men who have lived inside rituals long enough to make policy from them, that the sheet functions as a ledger of passage. A ledger of passage, they say, records thresholds, where a name crosses from memory into hazard, and the hours appointed to keep watch over that crossing. The phrase sits in my mouth like a foreign prayer I have no right to pronounce. Then a key slides across the table. It is smaller than I expected and heavier by implication than by brass. The bow is engraved with a symbol I do not recognize. The shank is worn smooth where many fingers have gripped it as if it were a rosary. Father Morley says, slowly and without indulgence, "It fits a duty, not a door. It fits responsibility you did not seek." Responsibility is a parishioner with many faces. It might be mercy, it might be penance. My hand closes around the metal, and I feel the sudden intimacy of an obligation I never asked to hold. They teach me rules like catechisms, phrases that read like prayers if you say them softly, or like warnings if you speak them aloud. Nulla apertura sine custodia, Morley intones, no opening without custody. Ultima vigilia numeranda, the catalogue man adds, count the last watch. They demonstrate the ledger's anatomy, name, location, transgression, date, tally. Slips of vellum are filed like specimens. The tally is not just a mark. It is a rhythm that sets when a thing is to be observed, and by whom. Counting becomes a form of containment, a way to fold anomaly back into ordinance. My training as an archivist has always been a litany of restraint. Measure, photograph, return. We are custodians, not storytellers. We stabilize data so others may testify. Yet here, pressed between vellum and breath, I feel the old rules flex like thin bone. The language they use corrodes categorical distance. It pulls names close into a table where each person becomes an index entry. In seminaries, they teach rubrics as forms of piety. Here the rubrics function as instruments. I wonder, with a professional unease, whether my curiosity is a breach of science or a trespass of devotion. A man with ink-stained fingers shows me an example ledger. The ticks are neat beside names. Marginalia fold into a shorthand of sigla that indicate the severity of a perturbation. He taps the tally and the sound is a metronome. They do not speak of erasure, they speak of allocation. We do not remove, Morley says. We assign. Assigning means a person will be watched, a name held by the duty of another until the tally reaches whatever completion this office deems necessary. Listening to them, I understand the ledger as a map of attention. Where attention is paid, something else is restrained. The room's hush grows thick as oil. The men's faces look like the covers of books I have handled, stamped, weathered, familiar in ways that make them terrible. Their calm offers the argument that what they do is administrative. It is the sort of monstrous practicality that hides beneath sanctity. They speak of replacement watches, of rotor and rotation, of moving a burden from one human hand to another. The vocabulary is both clerical and custodial, an odd cousinhood of the sacred and the municipal. One phrase haunts me: custodia nominum, custody of the names. I feel the syllables like a coin heavy in my pocket. I should have returned the sheet. I should have set the key on the table and left the vestry to its proper lights. Instead, I fold the parchment, slide the key into my pocket under my shirt where my pulse keeps steadier, and walk out with an impression that is part theft and part vow. When the bells strike across the square, their sound no longer rings purely of hours. It strings itself into a ledger I have not seen, a sequence I am only beginning to read. I carry a geography the office did not teach me. It sits in my hands like an ache. Who else knows these routes that my fingers now remember? Who opens the ledgers when the candle gutters and the names come due? I should have given it back, and I should have left the responsibility to hands weathered and willing. But I kept the key, and I kept the count, and I will wake at night hearing the bells as though they are already tallying what I will be called to keep. I should have stopped, but I kept it, and I fear what name the ledger will write next, tomorrow or never. Always. I tell myself the cathedral will be ordinary at midnight, because the brain prefers patterns it already knows. The nave exhales the last candlelight, and the choir stalls sit like fossilized bones beneath the high rafters, and I move among them with the soft-footed certainty of a man who has catalogued other people's relics. The red thread is subtle, a thin stitch of dyed fibre tucked under a carved misericorde where soot and time have earned their own textures. I should have left it alone. I follow because curiosity is a work-acquired vice I mistake for duty. My lamp is small, and the flame leans as if listening. It bows when I bend, and refuses the draughts that the cathedral of night still keeps. The stitch gives a tension under my fingers like a taut spine, and I trace it as if I were reading the confession of the building itself. The thread runs to a seam in the floor where the shell of a nail has been driven and concealed beneath a chip of oak. The hatch yields under pressure that is not merely physical but ceremonial. Wood opens the way a mouth parts to speak. When the hatch frees, air spills up smelling of wax and old paper and something like iron, an animal memory lodged in mortar. I take the ladder down into a room where the bits of the cathedral rearrange themselves. What overhead was arch and incense becomes low vaulting and the close, animal geometry of a throat. Shelves bracket the walls like ribs, boxes and cases sit dark as eyes. The red thread runs along the floor, a vascular line guiding me between cases as if directing a caretaker through a body. My lamp throws long sickle shadows, and the sound I expect, pipes, the scrape of a broom, does not come. The hush here is not absence but attention. It feels as though the place is waiting for me to behave correctly. On a shelf, I find cupboards marked with labels that read like a taxonomy of fault: idolatria, susurratio, abnegatio. Each case contains an object wrapped in cloth and cord. Some are jewelry, some are simple tools, some shapes that refuse an easy name. A ledger rests on a stand with a brass clip. Its pages are ruled, and my gloves make a small whisper against them. The ledger is an index of watches, and the columns are names and coordinates and dates. numeros that sound like appointments. I run a finger down a column, and the letters appear to sharpen under touch, as if ink knows when it will be read. When I find the entry with the name of my parish, my stomach tightens into a closed fist, and the lamp ticks louder in the sudden quiet. There are marginalia in Latin that read like administrative prayer. Ultima vigilia custodienda, rota custodii. The words themselves are not unfamiliar. Seminary training and canonical texts teach similar phrases, but here they land like pins. I pause at a notation that bears the name of a street from my childhood and feel, absurdly, the sensation of being observed through a ledger. A small, folded scrap is tucked into the margin. I open it with gloved hands, and there, on a scrap of vellum, is a tiny map fragment that matches the red stitch under the misericord. The map is not merely cartographic, it is a cross-reference system. The thread and the ledger are two halves of the same mechanism. A sound moves under the stone, a soft arithmetic that becomes the room's heartbeat, a ticking like a pen counting through a list. It is an absurd thing to imagine masonry counting, and yet the rhythm is inexorable. The red thread seems to pulse against my fingertips in time with that counting, and I realize that where the stitch is knotted corresponds to a ledger entry, not merely a route, but a linked index. The thread is a map of attention. The ledger is a map of consequence. I am not following a route so much as entering a ledger's reading. The thought settles with a cold, animal clarity. This place fixes names by attention, and the attention that draws breath here is a careful, procedural thing. Further along the thread, I find a case small enough to be hidden in a pocket. It is wrapped in oilcloth, labeled with a single word, censura, in a clerk's hand that has the cool precision of one who records for decades. Inside is nothing like a censor's stamp. Instead, a small chip of brass that has been pierced and etched with letters so fine they require a lens. The etching is a cipher of symbols that, when magnified, read like coordinates and marginal marks. The chip is warm against my glove, as if it has been held recently. When I hold it to the lamp, the etched letters seem to tremble with a transparency that is not merely optical. The shapes cohere into something my mind wants to pronounce and does not. It is then that the space ceases to be merely repository and becomes participant. The lamp's flame leans away, the shadows organize, and in the hush a whisper threads itself through the stacks as if some slow machine were undertaking its nightly accounting. I tell myself it is my heart, but I know that the sound is something older, a calculus of attentions being set, an office concluding an inventory. The ledger's columns feel like lungs, the names like breaths taken in and held. My hands are cataloguers' hands, trained to resist narrative and to stabilize objects, and yet they tremble as though the object in my palm had a request and expected an answer. I should have turned back when the candle flame bowed away from me. I should have closed the hatch and returned the thread to its sleeve in the misericord. Instead, I eased the chip into my pocket and slid the hatch closed as quietly as I could, because some small, private logic told me to keep the proof of what I had seen. I tell myself that possession will make me responsible, that by holding the object, I might control what I have been shown. But possession is a kind of consent, and the next morning the world is threaded differently. The bells seem to count in measures I have not learned, and the paving stones exhibit tiny brass chips at crossings, as if the city itself has been annotated. I move through the city acutely aware of measure. I keep my hands in my pockets as if to hide the token that has become a responsibility. That night, I sleep in fits and wake in a room where the dark has the thickness of a closed book. The red thread appears in my dreams, not as a stitch, but as an artery, and sometimes I wake with the impression that the stitch is tattooed along my skin. When I return to the vault, the ledger has a new notch I did not make. When I open the page, the marginal pencil seems to stutter into a date that presses on the future like a thumb. I tell myself I imagined the map's voice, that the catalogue's tally is merely paperwork given mythic weight by being forgotten in light. I tell myself I should have stopped, but I kept stepping toward the living dark, and now the dark knows my footprints. But I kept stepping toward the living dark, and now the dark knows my footprints. I find the seam because I am already looking for betrayal in stone. The cloister has taught me to read joints and weather, the way mortar bears scars like handwriting, and when a section of ashlar hums under my palm, it feels less like architecture and more like a throat learning another register. The brass handle is warm as if a hand had only just left it, warm in a place that cools with the patience of centuries. I pause because ordinary curiosity has become itself an accusation, and the heat under my fingers registers like a small, private guilt. The seam yields with the sound a hinge makes when it has kept a secret for a long time, a soft, admitting creak. I open the door and step into a room that, by any reasonably maintained plan, should not exist. The room beyond is not recorded on any plan I have seen. The archivist's blueprints stop at a faint fold, and someone long ago took the care to fold the world back on itself. Shelves run in neat lines where light does not touch. Small glass cases sit like eyelids closed against dust and time. The objects here are catalogued not by saint or by date, but by offense. Cards with headings, superstitio, dolatria, perfidia veritas, lean at the edges of shelves. Each sealed case contains something that resists being named. A rosary with beads that are not glass but bone, a scrap of cloth smelling faintly of seaweed, a ring filed smooth as if identity had been ground away. The effect is clinical rather than ornate, and that clinical air is what makes the place terrible. Someone has decided to be tidy about transgression. On a stand near the door, a ledger lies open, stopped mid-counting. Names crowd the ruled columns, and the ink shows the pressure of many hands. A clerk's neatness sits beside a novice's hurry, and the loopy calligraphy of someone who has lived long enough to let time teach their pen economy. I keep scanning, because an archivist is trained to look for provenance, for context, and because the act of reading a list is the simplest way to imagine the social body that made it. Then one name arrests me. The letters are not wholly unfamiliar. They sit angled as if the writer had wanted to be brief and efficient, not reverent. Beside that name, a terse instruction has been added in a practical hand: replace the last watch. At first I think the line is clerical, a rota note, a scheduling instruction, and then the other senses take up the work of understanding. Replace the last watch implies substitution of human attention. Where someone once stood vigil, another will stand in their stead. It implies a hole that will be filled. It implies a death of sorts, an emptying that requires another to be filled. I should have closed the ledger, set the handle back to cool, and left the room to the custodians who already know the cost of keeping such ledgers. Instead, I read on because reading feels like the first step in responsibility, and responsibility feels like a way of not being complicit. Objects in the cases react, as if they hear the ledger being read. The reliquary in the dim alcove breathes a waxy breath when I approach, and the lamp hanging from a chain tilts toward the page, as if trying to see. Small things shift. A folded swathe of cloth settles a fraction, a sealed envelope puckers inward. The room's hush thickens into the concentrated silence of a tribunal. The ledger's ruled columns begin to feel like an interrogation room rather than a record. Marginalia, Latin rubrics and shorthand sigla, tie names to dates and to tiny bell-like symbols. Someone has been counting in such a way that counting itself becomes a containment. I think of the warmth on the handle and reconstruct a chain of palms passing it from one tired hand to another. Custodianship is not abstract here. It is physical and repeated. An archivist organizes a community's memory so that the community can remember itself with some coherence. This ledger organizes attention deliberately and by rote so that whatever is named can be watched and perhaps contained. The phrases in the margins, custodia nominum, rota custodii, ultima vigilia, are practical. They read like a timetable because in this office ritual has been folded into administration. The saints are not invoked as intercessors so much as used as a vocabulary to schedule witnesses. A distant key turned in a lock elsewhere in the building sounds through the stone like a metronome. It sets the room's heart to a measured rhythm. For a moment, I feel the obligation to obey the older rule that governs my trade: stabilize, document, return. To take an object out of a context that the office has constructed is to risk corrupting the entire schema. But the ledger will not let me abide by neutrality. Its optical gravity draws me in. I recognize my own professional gestures in the way my hands slide over the paper, gentle, precise. But my breath accelerates because the ledger has named a vacancy, and the idea of vacancy made personal is an urgent thing. Tucked inside the ledger's back is a folded rubric printed in Latin and Italian. Ad hoc, mutatio custodiae, nota, ultima vigilia. It sets a date, an initial, a sealed note that reports the decision of someone whose signature is abbreviated to a loop and a flourish. The time named is not yet come. The place specified resides on my mental map like a bruise. The document makes the prospective particular. The future becomes something that might be documented, assigned, and handed off. The bureaucratic tone of the paper makes the threat colder and therefore more credible. Replace the last watch reads not like a request, but an enacted ordinance. My training tells me how to respond, photograph, transcribe, inform a superior. But other things complicate the sequence. The handle in the stone, the warmth it has borne, the way the lamp leaned toward the ledger as if in consultation. I fold the rubric carefully and slide it into my pocket because possession is a way of translating uncertainty into an action I can perform. Above, the cathedral breathes on its long clock, and the bells mark the hours as they have always done. Yet the sound this time is a series of small strokes, like a tally in ink. I walk back through the seam in the stone, and the door settles in the same hush as before, as if it had never been opened. I should have stopped when my name rose on the page. I should have set the handle back to its cool rightness and left the ledger to its dust and its custodians. Instead, I carried a folded instruction in my pocket and the sense of a responsibility I never volunteered for. The thought that someone will stand in the watch, I might have been called to take presses like a ledgerweight against my ribs. Wherever I look, I expect to see marginal marks tighten like nooses. The ledger counts, and I have let it begin. I will wake to bells that ask whether I answered when the ledger called. I cannot tell which will be worse. I will wake to bells that ask whether I answered when the ledger called. I cannot tell which will be worse. I open the catalogue with the reverence of someone turning a family Bible, because that is what this place insists upon, that records be treated like sacraments. The pages smell of iron and vellum and the patience of clerks. Each card is a specimen pinned beneath glass. The script lists an offense, a date, a place. They separate peccadillos from perdition with the clinical precision of a naturalist categorizing specimens. A header, Idolatry, sealed, 1724, reads like a museum label. Whispered blasphemy. Embalmed, 1891. These are the sorts of captions one expects in a cabinet of curiosities, not in the back room of a cathedral. The clerical hand is neat and exact. Each stroke of ink is a decision about hierarchy. My hands are steady because training teaches steadiness first. I have catalogued birth registers and donor lists, fragile sermons and brittle parish newsletters, but nothing in my index work prepared me to see sins recorded as if they were insects mounted on pins. The clerical hand is exact. The ink sometimes faded to the color of old tea. Marginal notes in different hands annotate consequences, rotating custodianship, and the odd siglum that seems to function as a severity index. They have measured transgression here as one might measure specimens, species, date, provenance. The language makes the ecclesiastical grotesque by domesticating it. An offense becomes a file, shame becomes a box number. I slide my finger into a place where the cards are stacked in alphabetical order and let my eyes wander like a blind man along a rope. The names of offenses read like a litany. Superstitio, embezzlement from a saint's feast, false witness, usury, secret marriage, desecration. Each card bears a tidy label and a cross-reference to a box number. For each, a short note in the margin might record who was assigned to watch, for how many vigils, and under what rubric. The catalogue is not a confession. It is a program for attention. It instructs the church in distribution of time, the allocation of watchers. Reading it feels less like eavesdropping than like opening a manual for observation. Then my finger finds a card that makes the air change around me. The header lists my old parish with the name of the street I grew up on. It is such an ordinary detail to see, like finding a photograph of a small, familiar lamp in an archive otherwise full of strangers, that my brain registers it before the heart does. Then the margin has a tally in a different ink, a fresh dark stroke among the paler ticks of years past. The tally is not merely a mark, it feels like a pressure applied to paper. My training obliges me to test, to confirm. I watch the margin, and as if in reply the ink settles and a new line kisses the paper. The movement is slight, but the effect is volcanic inside my chest. I should have closed the catalogue then and returned the card to its slot. Anything that changes with the act of looking is not neutral, and I have been schooled to avoid instruments that answer back. But the mark wanted me to see. The scholar in me, always eager for primary evidence, leans forward. I take out a loupe and examine the ink under magnification. The new tick is made with the same nib as the older list, but the pressure varies. The last line looks urgent in a way the clerical entries rarely are. There is the faintest scent of resin near the margin, as though a candle had been lit just to witness the making of the mark. There is a sense in which catalogues lie. They give the impression that order is complete, that each object has been seen and labelled. This catalogue betrays that lie because it accepts new marks as though it had been waiting. The marginalia include cryptic notes, rota mutata, custodia ad habenda, numerus adjunctus. Someone, some office with a slow mechanical patience, updates these rows as if a ledger were a living organism that feeds on attention. The idea that an inventory can be nourished by observation undermines every neutral principle of archival science I was taught. It is as if the book needs to be read to remain whole. Who does the adding? I ask the ceiling absurdly, as if the stone will reply, and for a moment there is the echo of a bell, and then the silence that answers too slowly. There are plausible human explanations. A clerk on the night rota, an obsessed volunteer, the archivist performing maintenance after hours. I consider these because my education insists on exhausting natural explanations before invoking the miraculous. Yet each explanation falters when held up to the facts. The fresh tick appears precisely as I look, and no camera in the room recorded anyone else. If a person does it, they do it only when the book senses me looking, and who operates such an apparatus in the hours when prayer is thin. The catalogue's design makes it easy to become a conspirator without intending to. The organization of boxes and slips, the tidy cross-references, the list of names that recurs in different rubrics, they all suggest a system in which maintenance is transacted by gestures of attention. If names become thresholds, the ledger's caretakers are gatekeepers. I think of the way the vestry men spoke of custodia nominum. I think of the key I carry that is metal and burden both. Possessing knowledge in this context is ambiguous. Information is not simply power, but also an obligation, a thing that obliges you to be watched in return. I should have left the ledger and its living margins alone, left its tick marks to some quiet office, and closed the room with a padlock and a prayer. But possession is an easy sort of arrogance. We tell ourselves that to know is to be able to control, that archival evidence can be quarantined. I photograph the card with the pocket camera I use for documentation, because documentation is what I do, and because it is a ritual I recognize. The photograph captures the card exactly as it looks, a static, faithful reproduction. Yet the image preserves the fresh tick as well, and the file sits on my camera like a stone that knows my name. At night I dream of pins and ink and small clerical hands making ticks. I wake with a sense that tally marks arrange themselves across the city, across faces I meet in the market, across the blank pages of the ledger I have begun to keep in my own head. The catalogue, framed and neat, has found a way into the infrastructure of my life, and I keep expecting a clerk to knock at my door with a new tallied card to read. I should have stopped when the ink made the new stroke under my eye. Instead, I let the strike become evidence that I had been seen. I begin a private register in the evenings, a poor mimicry of the ledger's authority, because habit makes order bearable, and I am infected by the idea that attention wards things. I note the tiny brass chips in pavements, bells that toll long, faces that seem to carry small, private weights. The register is superstition, dressed in clerical ink, yet it comforts me as a map once comforted sailors. If you can plot a storm, you are less likely to be lost in it. Sometimes I place the ledger card beside my notes, as if proximity could transfer authority. Sometimes I whisper the Latin rubrics to myself, because the words steady the skin on my hands. I know this is folly, but folly can be useful. It buys me time to watch, and perhaps to intervene before a tally closes. Yet every entry feels like consent, and the ledger's appetite grows when fed by my attention. I should have written none of this. I tell myself I will return the card, put the ledger back under its glass, and live as if the catalogue had never opened. But evenings find me at the table, rubbing the margin with a fingertip like a ward, and I wake hearing paper sigh as if the book has closed on me. I keep waiting for the knock that will bring the next tallied card, and in the quiet hours, I hear the ledger breathe my name like a summons. They feed lanterns slides onto plaster like a blasphemous homily, and the room rearranges itself around the light. The projection is not a picture, but a procession. Latin declensions unspool across the wall like fish moving in a slow current, nouns bending and genitives clinging like barnacles. The air smells of projector oil and dust, and the low mineral tang of a place that has been catalogued too often. Men sit in a semicircle with their faces half-lit, and the light makes their eyes reflective, as if the people in the room are a school of quiet mirrors. At first I think it is a lecture, an archival demonstration on paleographic forms, but the cadence is not academic. The Latin moves in liturgical rhythms. Verbs are conjugated like prayers, and an intoned vowel hangs in the space between one clause and the next. It feels less like learning and more like enactment. My training tells me to take notes, to document the methods, to transcribe what I can for later study. Habit comforts until curiosity stops being comfort and becomes compulsion. The slides flick past, each one a cartouche. Nomen, locus, numerus, debitum. The words are simple, but in the dim they become incantation. A thin man with a tight mouth reads from a script, and the voice on a spool answers with a thicker cadence. The room leans toward the wall as if listening. For a moment, my recorder captures nothing but the swell and ebb of breath and the projector's gentle whine. Then my name appears across plaster in unambiguous, ancient case. I feel my hands go cold, and I look down at the recorder in my palm like it might weigh differently now. The man reading does not hesitate. The projected letters roll my name into a phrase I do not expect. The older voice on the spool pronounces it as if calling a roll. It is an absurd sensation to hear a personal sound, as if someone else had supraliminal access to the notes my life keeps. The projected letters slide into an instruction, an arrangement of syllables that maps itself onto something ahead of me. I stop the spool because my fingers betray me before my head does. The room's murmurs freeze. Someone exhales. It might be relief or a blade. I tell myself I will leave then, go into the night, and pretend my curiosity had been an accident, but instead I rewind and listen. The voice from the box is mine, an interview I recorded years ago about parish customs, clipped and patient, read in the tone I used when discussing banalities. It now pronounces a future the projector has framed for it. It feels like a betrayal of time. Either someone edited my taped speech to make prediction, or the act of playing my voice made the projected words select that voice and fold the future into recorded present. I try to think of mechanisms, splicing, cueing, a clerk with dramatic taste, but the spool came from a sealed box I had handled without noticing. The thought that my voice could be coerced into announcing a fate I have not yet enacted is a small erasure of agency. The sense that a recorded syllable can be made to behave as prophecy rather than testimony. There is a moment when a device meant to preserve fact becomes an oracle. The recorder's tape, designed to hold interviews and dates, begins to sound like a summons. The projector, intended to make letters visible, performs a decree. I ask myself whether machine can be complicit or whether the complicit is always the hand that turns the spool. I imagine clerks who splice tapes at night. men with neat habits leaning over plates and aligning light to voice until the past and the future blur. I picture ritualized procedures that sanctify technique, calibration as devotion, playback as prayer, and wonder whether the instruments merely echo human desire or make it irreversible. Either way, the room expects an answer, and I am obliged to respond. I ask the man nearest me whether he cued the fragment, and he shrugs with professional detachment. Routine, he says. We calibrate projection with recordings. The word sounds neutral, but it feels like a dodge. I ask what the projection is for, and he replies, counting, attention, witness. Counting, as if a room that projects names becomes an authority that numbers presence. Attention, as if looking itself is a sacrament that binds whatever is observed. Later, in the quiet office, I spin the spool under a lamp and slow it until artifacts reveal themselves. Faint breaths before my name, a tiny hiss like a pen running across paper, a click that might be a page turning. The artifacts form a grammar. They imply procedure. Play the tape, project the name, allow the room to receive it. The procedure resembles municipal ritual more than sacrament, and perhaps that is the point, the mundane cloaked as ordinance. I should have left when my voice pronounced a future, and I tell myself I will break the spool or throw away the projection plates. Instead, I piece apart the protocol like a technician separating fibers under microscope. I record the recorder, I note projection, calibration, spool origin, ledger correlation. The discipline of classification steadies me even as it marshals my complicity. To write an index about destiny feels like hubris, yet in discipline there is a place to begin. On rainy evenings, I play the spool with a lamp because curiosity is a narcotic, and because at the edge of curiosity, one can pretend for a while to be in control. The projector and the tape fold together like two mirrors reflecting the same face until it is impossible to say which is original and which the echo. That ambiguity gnaws at the idea that a name is merely an identifier. Here a name is a node in an apparatus that responds and perhaps anticipates. The more I listen, the more the apparatus seems determined to refine itself. I do not yet know whether they are reading my fate or writing it. The ledger and the projection and my own voice are in collusion, and whatever conspiracy is here counts on my attention to complete the transaction. I keep the spool in my drawer and the plates in a folder. I photograph the projected frames and file them. I tell myself documentation is containment. It might be. It might be the act that makes the tally final. Each replay tightens something unseen around my days, a small circumference of expectation where every bell might register my name on a ledger. The next morning, the bells over the square ring with a tone that feels like a ledger closing. I carry my notes and the spool like contraband, and I walk with the sense that at any crossing someone could look up a column and mark my line with a new tick. I tell myself I should have stopped when the projection named me. I tell myself that leaving is a moral act. But I rewind the tape again at night, because not knowing seems worse than being read. I cannot tell whether they are reading me or writing me, and that uncertainty is the slowest kind of sentence. I find the confessional because the map's lines have become a ritual and a route. Habit leads feet where maps once instructed. The lower vaults hold heat like memory, and the corridor smells of wax and iron. The confessional here is a thing of economy. No ornate grille, no decorative screen, only a slit for speech and a fogging pane that catches breath like a palm. It sits behind a door that has been tightened and sealed by more than wood. To open it feels less like entering a room and more like stepping into an apparatus designed to receive. The wood is worn where foreheads have leaned, and the lacquered lip, where one rests an elbow, bears the faint gloss of many palms. I am trained to recognize objects as evidence and thresholds as data. Even so, the confessional's design arrests me, because it is not made for ritual theater, but for private transactions that prefer anonymity. I took an apple when I was 7, I whisper, the sentence as foolish as I intend it to be. I expect the gap to answer with silence or the scrape of old timber. Instead, the voice that answers is immediate and unnervingly near. It is not the practiced, cadenced response of a confessor. It is an inland sound, a voice that seems to originate from the geometry of the room itself. It names not the apple, but a night I had wrapped in silence. The night my father failed to come home, and the way I stood at the window and learned that some promises are brittle. The naming is precise, as if the room has access to the corners of memory people assume time will smooth. I take a breath that tastes like dust, and the pain fogs with that small, private exhalation. I test boundaries because testing is how I work. I invent a sin, a petty cruelty, a half-truth, and I speak it with the care of someone who knows confession can be a tautology. The voice replies with a fragment of a prayer my mother taught me when I was small, a blessing I have said to ward off cold. It pronounces those words without cadence or pity, turning a domestic charm into something clinical, as if the phrase must be formally recorded. For a second I assume the answer is my own memory echoed back. Then I hear a timbre in the reply that is not mine, a punctuation that suggests another mouth has shaped the syllables. The room is not echoing me, it is conversing with a ledger. Questions have been my habit since I accepted the key and the ledger. I learned to ask to locate, to map, to know. I press the slit again and ask for names, not formal names, but the private epithets we keep for ourselves in the dark. The boy I shoved in the lane, the friend whose secret I bartered for some small advantage. The shadow answers with a litany that is neither malicious nor merciful. It is precise and patient, like a registrar reciting events from an index. It lists small cruelties, neglected promises, the soft betrayals that stitch a life together. Each name lands like a small incision, and I feel them as cuts, honest and exact. The inventorying of my life in that voice turns memory into evidence. When I ask whether these entries are kept, the slit breathes, and the voice answers in Latin, nota in tabula, as if to confirm that speech here is converted into inscription. The confessional becomes a device that translates admission into record, the act of confession formalized into bookkeeping. I have been taught that confession is a sacrament of reconciliation. This place treats confession as testimony that feeds a ledger. The nuance matters. Reconciliation erases. Testimony records. The difference is a mechanism for accountability or a machine for accumulation, and I cannot tell which the vault intends. I try to withdraw when the voice names a cramped street from my childhood I had assumed time would smooth, an alley where I left a friend to save myself from a dog. My throat tightens not from shame alone, but because the vault claims a precision of memory I had planned to forget. It lays out the geometry of my regrets with a clarity that refuses kindness. I should have stopped when it repeated my mother's prayer, I think, the thought heavy as a stone in my chest. Yet the compulsion to ask more, to know the limits of this strange apparatus, refuses to let me go. I press on because information is how I imagine agency. The shadow's manner is not cruel so much as administrative. It knows the cadence of detail and the order of dates. The difference between an archivist and a tormentor narrows when attentiveness replaces mercy. A clerk who will not forget becomes a different kind of monster. I speak and it catalogues. I confess and it binds. Each admission is given a small notation like a ledger's tally, and I feel the shift from person to entry as a physical queasiness. There is no priestly absolution here, no hand laid across my head. There is only the implacable efficiency of a register that needs witnesses to be complete. When at last I rise, the pain of the confessional clears, and the slit exhales like someone closing a book. My forehead keeps the wood's ghost heat for a moment longer. It is the memory of another's fingers. The door behind me settles with the ordinary finality of carpentry, and for a mapped instant the vault seems no more than stone and shadow. I put my gloves back on with the ritual slowness of a man who knows he has been altered by a task, and walk out into the cloister light, with the ledger's metrics held like a weight inside my chest. I tell myself I will not return, that silence will be my redaction, that the ledger cannot speak without me. Yet the confessional keeps a fog of my breath on its pain, and sometimes when I pass the stair I pause and find my fingertips remembering the slit. Who listens when we unburden ourselves beneath stone? The lesson here is not merely theological but bureaucratic. Confession without mercy is not release but registration. and registration requires witnesses. I gave the vault a sentence, and it filed it like a document, and now I still wait to see which of my admissions the ledger will count against me next. I should have stopped when the shadow said my mother's prayer, but I kept giving it syllables, and now I still wait to see which of my admissions the ledger will count against me next. The map leads deeper than any plan I knew, to a sub-terry the archivist named with a shrug that pretended ignorance. Down there is a chapel that refuses ordinary liturgy, altars stitched from femurs, votive candles that weep like sutures, and a saint-shaped statue whose face shuts as if to keep a last secret. The plaster tastes of salt and old oaths. The place reads like a litany for a church that traded mercy for method. I should have stopped when the humming rose, bells drowned in mud, but the statue's lips mouthed a psalm that lodged behind my teeth and would not leave. The stair that leads down to the sub-terry is narrow and smells like basements everywhere. Damp stone, old glue, and the faint copper of old blood not quite gone. I take it 3 steps at a time because impatience is thinner than fear, and because once curiosity has held a map in one's hand, it tends to feel like a mandate. The light fails in the lower vestibule, and a single lamp dangles on a chain, throwing the shadows lengthwise across the threshold. When the chapel reveals itself, the first sensation is one of awkward taxidermy. Things arranged to look reverent that should not be called reverent. The altar is an anatomy lesson made doctrine. Femurs arranged like ribs, humeri stacked in an orderly frieze, and smaller bones braided into a pattern that can be read like a calendar. Candles, set into sockets bored into pelvic bones, drip wax that strings and knots like white suture thread. The effect is deliberate and precise. This is not crude desecration, but the work of someone with hands that respect order and a mind that thinks in indexes. I walk toward the altar because steps are a poor substitute for courage, and because the ledger's arithmetic has already rewired me to seek the nodes that registers mark. The statue near the altar is not a saint, as I learned saints appear but a saint-shaped thing, carved and patched, and then lacquered with the care given to reliquaries. It tilts its head, as if listening, and when I come close enough, the face closes slowly like a lid being lowered on a box. The eyes are not hollow in the theatrical sense, but sealed by something like a shutter, and when the lips fold together, they make the faint sound of velum closing. The gesture is not violent so much as corrective. The chapel has modified a human posture into a vow. I know then that this place was intended to change the way one worships, to reroute supplication into a closed circuit of observation. There is a hum in the air that is the first alarm. It is not a bell as I have heard bells, the light, crystalline peals of ours, but a low, subterranean intonation that feels as though the stone itself has begun to count. The hum is like the sound of a machine with a patient calculation, the kind of sound that removes soft edges from thought and replaces them with a ledger's geometry. When I think of bells, my mind supplies an ecclesiastical cadence. This hum suggests something older and meaner, bells muffled under mud, the sound of counting reduced to gravity. The presence of that hum makes prayer feel like an entry being logged, a breath being itemized. I should have stopped when that noise first rose in the chapel's throat, because anything that insists on measuring devotion is already a bureaucrat of souls. The plaster tastes like salt when I press my tongue to the wall the way an archaeologist might taste the lime of a newly uncovered mortar, and the taste is of old oaths and the minerals that soak into vows. Scrawled across a section of wall, penciled, then inked, then scoured and overwritten, are not the usual devotional inscriptions, but what look like entries. Names and small marks and dates, some in Latin, some in the vernacular, margins notations like a clerk's shorthand. It reads like graffiti made by accountants. I trace one line, and my fingers feel the indent where a stylus pressed too hard, and in the indentation my fingertips find the orphaned impression of a name. My own breath slows. The statuary's lips move then, almost imperceptibly, and I become aware that the sound is not wind through stone, but the articulation of a psalm the statue seems to know. What it says is old and soft, and carries the cadence of a prayer learned at a mother's knee, but there is no tenderness in the tone. It is practiced and obliging, as if the figure is reciting the shape of piety the chapel expects. I listen and the psalm lodges. It is not composed as consolation, but as inventory. The words align with ledger logic: recordia, nota, teen, remember, note, hold. The psalm is a manual as much as a hymn, a liturgy that asks the worshipper to perform the act of being observed. I find with a cold clarity that the rite of this chapel is surveillance dressed in sacrament. Mercy, if it exists here, is mediated by measure. There is no absolution offered as release. There is only the careful marking of who offered what and when, the transformation of a confession into a dated event. The statue's lips continue to shape the psalm, and I feel the words settle like dust in my ears, making a record that I cannot unhear. I should have stopped when the sound turned liturgy into ledger. But each time I have been offered a surface where a score is being kept, I have found it difficult to step away, because knowledge feels like a tool, and because denial seems worse than discovery. I move closer to the base of the statue and find a small niche that holds a book sewn in leather the color of coagulated wax. Someone has taken pains to bind it as if it were a text that must not be lost. Inside are pages filled with entries, names, times, brief notes in a hand that alternates between the briskness of clerical notation and the flourishes of a writer who still remembers liturgy. There is a column marked Custodia and another for Terminus. Beside my own name, in a hand I do not recognize, someone has written Mutatio Imminens, change imminent. The ink is not fresh, but it is not old either. It sits at that uneasy place where a thing is still in calendar months, not years. There is a quiet that follows this discovery, a hush that feels as if the chapel is waiting for my response, and in that hush I become a ledger item myself, present, noted, awaiting instruction. The idea that a holy place could be organized around the exportation of mercy into measures is a transgression more precise than any superstition. When worship requires accounting, when charity is scheduled, the spiritual becomes municipal. I knew as an archivist that records are instruments of power. Here I see those instruments made theological. A saint in this chapel has been repurposed into a functionary. It keeps watch by closing its eyes. It prays by recording. It is a saint like an office, a relic made into a register. I leave with the book tucked beneath my arm, because leaving it behind feels like abandoning possession to a system I do not yet comprehend, and because possession somehow feels like the first imperfect form of resistance. Outside the stair, the air seems too bright, and the bells above the cloister ring in tones that feel now less like comfort than like signature strokes. I tell myself I will destroy the book, that I will return it to the deep where ledger and statue conspire, and that I will refuse to be counted. But when I pause at the top landing and look back down into the seam of stone, the hum rises as if in acknowledgement, and I know that the ledger has already written me into its next column. I should have stopped when the chapel taught me to measure prayer, but I kept the book, and now I cannot tell whether I rescued a relic or smuggled myself into the ledger's next tally. I take the map to the hearth because panic is an honest currency, and because the archivist's disposal fire is the only place I can imagine would accept something that looks like a sentence written in blood. The conservation room smells of soot and boiled oil, lemon wax and old glue, small domestic sanctities that make me believe, briefly and foolishly, that destruction might be a mercy. I lay the sheet on the iron, and the flame leans toward the edge like a curious animal, glancing the vellum and testing the ink with a hunger I mistakenly interpret as cooperation. Vellum resists in its own way. The ink runs in black veins, and the paper curls like a dying leaf. I strike a match with a practiced hand, and the flame takes hold, and for a moment the act feels like an exorcism I do not deserve. The work of conservation has taught me how things disintegrate, how their decay can be made tidy. My training promises that things can be reduced to their components and then disposed of. I remind myself of procedure: photograph, document, register, and I tell myself this is procedure with the added finality of fire. Smoke rises and changes the room. The air thickens with a metallic tang that tastes, absurdly, like old confession. The archivist watches with the calm of a man who has fed many ruined books to this same hearth, and his composure steadies me until I notice that the ash does not fall at random. The black flakes gather and slide in small swells, settling into lines as if an invisible clerk were laying them out with a steady hand. At first I tell myself I am seeing patterns because my eye makes maps of anything that will hold them. My training has taught me to seek order even where there is ruin. Yet the shapes sharpen, numerals form, then letters, then a date that is not in my past but strikes forward like an accusation. Beside the date, an arrangement of ash twists into letters that form a name, my name, rendered with a neatness that makes me ashamed and vindicated at once. I should have snuffed the fire then, shoved the embers into the yard, buried the charred scrap in the river, and pretended I had never held it. Instead, I stand and watch as soot makes schedules, and the hearth returns a verdict in residue. The place meant to cleanse the damaged and record their disposal has become an altar that returns offerings in the form of instruction. There is a framed motto in the conservation room in Latin, Mala ignis non incendit, a phrase that once read like an elegy about the limits of destruction. Now that phrase feels like mockery. The fire will not swallow what should be erased. Smoke tastes of iron and confession in my mouth, and the bell in the square reads like a punctuation I cannot ignore. I try to bracket the experience with rational explanations. Perhaps it is pareidolia, my brain filling meaning into randomness. Perhaps the archivist's routine about hearth maintenance has arranged the remains by habit, and I am the only witness to a private choreography. Photographs should be proof. I photograph the ashes, adjust contrast and scale, examine the images in black and white until the numerals hold as solid as engraving. The digits remain. The name remains. I place the raw files in a folder labeled incident, ash notation, because habit insists that evidence be labeled. Yet the act of documentation feels like feeding the thing that wants to count. The more I make records, the more complicit I become. What was once a stabilizing ritual of my trade now ties me into the ledger's syntax. I try physical remedies. The next night I scoop the ash into a small iron pot and take it to the river. I let the black spill into the current and watch it dissolve into eddy and foam, as if confession had been surrendered to water. The relief is brief. The city keeps its own geography of notation. A retired registrar says the phrase ultima vigilia at a vestry meeting as casually as one might mention weather, and the bell over the square rings at a time that does not match the liturgical calendar. A volunteer averts her gaze in a way that reads like a marginal mark. Each of these small events feels like a clerk making a notation. Brief, precise, and then gone, but the notations accumulate. I learn that the ledger works through social channels as well as ink. Names I only half remember register themselves in the margins of what happens next, as if the world itself is annotating my presence. Patterns emerge at odd hours. Dinners cancelled with bureaucratic brevity, the sudden reassignment of mundane duties, the appearance of forms one had not been asked to sign. The apparatus that counts is not concealed in a single folio. It is distributed through practice, habit, and small human transactions. The burning was my attempt at a private reckoning. It reveals the necessity of public procedure. In the archivist's office, there is a binder labeled remedies and cancellations. Its language is bureaucratic and stingingly precise. Procedures for the deaccessioning of ritual objects, methods for reintegration, the forms one must fill to register that an item is to be removed from the catalogue of things to be watched. One line seizes my attention: destructio non est abolito. Destruction is not abolition. The binder offers recipes for nullity, ritual cleansing, reburial, formal notation of cancellation, but each requires witnesses, formal closure, signatures, and countersigns. The remedies are communal, slow, and administrative. Understanding that humility crushes me, I had attempted a private solution, fire, a ceremonial erasure, and discovered the ledger's logic is civic. If an entry is to be removed from the record, the office that keeps the record must agree to the removal. The instruments of record hold power precisely because they are witnessed. Cancellation requires the body that observes to witness the cancellation. I have no authority to convene such a body. I am small, and my single act of destruction reads to the ledger as a breach rather than a remedy. I submit myself to half measures because paralysis would be consent. I bury a pinch of the ash under a hawthorn in the churchyard. I leave a formal query in the archivist's in tray asking for counsel. I draft a note to a retired registrar to ask what procedure might apply. Each small ritual buys nothing but time. The ledger tightens. People I barely know adopt the grammar of notation in their interactions with me. A neighbor's casual question feels like a clerk marking a tally. The map's ash has become an administrative obsession, and I find myself roughed by the infrastructure of counting. There is a humiliation in that dependency. My attempt at annihilation failed because erasure in this place is a public transaction. The binder insists on witnesses and certificates. Mercy in this structure must wear the coat of office. The thought that mercy should be mediated by procedure is the worst lesson. Cruelty gains a veneer of legitimacy when it is translated into forms and signatures. I hold the folded map now, its charred edges brittle beneath my glove, and the question repeats itself with a persistence that has become a kind of background noise. I realize then that the ledger is more than paper. It is jurisdiction. To reverse its decree would demand witnesses, a formal right of cancellation, and a courage I cannot summon. To reverse its decree would demand witnesses, a formal right of cancellation, and a courage I cannot summon.